Standing in that courtroom, I watched in horror as the judge pointed his finger directly in my blind son's face, humiliating him for simply trying to live with dignity. That's exactly what happened when my son and I fought against our HOA's unreasonable demands. What this arrogant judge didn't realize was that his cruel words would be the last he'd ever speak from behind that bench. After 30 years of military service, I thought I'd finally found the perfect place to settle down. Oakridge Estates, a beautiful gated community with manicured lawns and friendly neighbors, a place where my son Jason and I could start fresh. 2 years ago, Jason's life changed forever. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit his school bus. Jason survived, but he lost his sight completely. At just 15, my boy had to learn how to navigate life in total darkness. The recovery was brutal. Months of rehabilitation, learning to use a white cane, and adapting to a world he could no longer see. But Jason's spirit never broke. "Dad," he'd say, "I'm still me. I just see differently now." When we moved to Oakridge, our neighbors seemed welcoming. Mrs. Peterson brought over homemade cookies. The Johnsons helped us unpack. Everyone smiled and waved when we walked by. Jason was determined to maintain his independence. He memorized the layout of our house, learned to cook simple meals, and even started attending the local high school. I was so proud watching him refuse to let his disability define him. We had no idea that our simple modifications to help Jason navigate our property would trigger such hostility. No idea that a power-hungry HOA judge would soon target my son simply for being different. It started with the tactile guidance markers, simple yellow strips with raised patterns that I installed along our driveway and front walkway to help Jason navigate safely to and from our home. Nothing flashy, just essential tools for my son's independence. 3 weeks after installation, the first letter arrived. Unauthorized property modifications in violation of HOA Covenant Section 12.3. The letter demanded immediate removal of the unsightly yellow additions to our property. I called the HOA office the next morning. "These aren't decorations," I explained to the administrator. "They're necessary accommodations for my blind son. He needs them to navigate safely." "All modifications require prior approval," she responded flatly. "The architectural committee doesn't make exceptions." I submitted a formal accommodation request with a letter from Jason's occupational therapist explaining the necessity of the markers. 2 weeks passed with no response. Then came a second violation notice, this one with teeth. 100 daily fines will commence in 72 hours unless all non-conforming elements are removed. That's when I learned about Walter Harmon, the retired county judge who now chaired the HOA Architectural Committee, a man known for his rigid enforcement of community standards. "He's rejected every variance request in the last 3 years," my neighbor Rick confided. "Claims he's protecting community standards, but between us, he just likes the power." I tried reasoning with him directly, calling his home. "Judge Harmon, please understand." He cut me off before I could finish. "Rules apply equally to everyone, Mr. Reynolds. No exceptions, no special treatment. Remove those eyesores or pay the consequences." That's when I knew this wasn't about community standards. This was about control, and my son's needs didn't factor into his equation at all. When Jason came home from school that day, he tripped on the curb without his markers. His white cane clattered to the ground, and he fell hard on the concrete. I ran to help him, my heart breaking as I saw blood trickling from his scraped palms. "Dad, why are the markers gone?" he asked, his voice shaking with confusion. "I had to remove them temporarily, son. The HOA says they're against the rules." His face fell. "But how am I supposed to get around safely?" That question burned in my chest as I helped him inside. That night, I reinstalled the markers. If they wanted to fine us, so be it. My son's safety wasn't negotiable. The next day, I found Judge Harmon himself standing in our driveway taking photographs of our home. When he saw me, he didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. "This will be added to your violation file," he said coldly, gesturing toward the markers. My son fell yesterday without these markers, I told him. He hurt himself. Harmon's expression didn't change. Not my problem. Should have thought about accessibility before you moved here. As he turned to leave, he added over his shoulder, by the way, the committee has unanimously rejected your accommodation request. The fines start tomorrow. I watched him walk away, fury building inside me. This wasn't just about yellow strips anymore. This was about a young man's right to navigate his own home with dignity, and I wasn't going to let a power-hungry ex-judge take that away from my son. That weekend, I knocked on every door in our neighborhood. Most people listened politely, but I could see the hesitation in their eyes. Nobody wanted to challenge Judge Harmon's authority. "I'm sorry about your son, truly," said Mrs. Dalloway from across the street. "But we signed the covenants when we moved in. Rules are rules." Just as my hope was fading, 3 neighbors surprised me. The Patels, whose daughter used a wheelchair, the Wilsons, whose elderly father lived with them, and Tom Green, a retired civil rights attorney. "This is wrong," Tom said firmly at our next community meeting. Standing up in front of everyone, he addressed the room. "Reasonable accommodations for disabilities aren't just a courtesy. They're protected by federal law." The room fell silent. Judge Harmon's face darkened as Tom continued. "The Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act both supersede HOA regulations. You can't deny necessary modifications for a disabled resident." 2 other residents stood to share their support. Mrs. Patel described her own struggles getting a wheelchair ramp approved. Judge Harmon told me it would disrupt the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. That night, Tom introduced me to Sarah Jacobson, a disability rights attorney who specialized in housing discrimination. "I've been waiting for someone to stand up to Harmon," she told me. "I'll take your case pro bono." Sarah explained that the law was clearly on our side. Homeowners associations must provide reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities. Your tactile markers certainly qualify. We spent the next week gathering documentation, Jason's medical records, letters from his doctors and mobility specialists, photographs of the markers, and copies of all HOA correspondence. "Document everything," Sarah advised. "Every interaction, every comment, every violation notice." I also discovered that Judge Harmon had denied similar accommodations to 3 other residents with disabilities. An elderly man with Parkinson's was denied permission for a handrail. A veteran with PTSD couldn't get approval for privacy screening. A woman with lupus was fined for installing an awning to shield her from the sun. "He's building a pattern of discrimination," Sarah explained, "and that strengthens our case." As the daily fines mounted, reaching over $800, Sarah filed for an emergency hearing with the full HOA board. "They need to hear your son's story directly," she said, "and they need to understand they're risking a federal discrimination lawsuit." The night before the hearing, Jason asked me a question that broke my heart. "Dad, why does this judge hate me? Is it because I'm blind?" I pulled my son close. "He doesn't hate you, Jason. He just loves control more than he cares about people. But we're going to change that. Tomorrow, we're going to fight for your right to move freely in your own home." What I didn't tell him was how nervous I was about confronting Judge Harmon, a man accustomed to being the final authority, a man who had never faced consequences for his decisions. Tomorrow would change everything, but I had no idea just how dramatically. Monday morning arrived with a knot in my stomach. Jason opted for simplicity, navy pants, and a plain blue t-shirt. "I don't need fancy clothes to deserve respect," he said. "I just want to be comfortable while I speak my truth." The HOA had rented the county courthouse for special disciplinary hearings, a practice Harmon had insisted on to maintain proper decorum. As we approached the building, I described the scene to Jason. "We're in an actual courtroom. Harmon arranged to use it for HOA hearings. He's wearing his old judicial robe and sitting at the judge's bench like this is an official court proceeding. 6 other board members are seated below him at a table. About 20 residents are sitting in the gallery." I felt Jason's grip tighten on my arm. "I'm nervous, Dad." "Me too, son, but we're in the right." Sarah met us outside, professional in her tailored suit. Remember, stay calm no matter what. Let me do most of the talking, but be ready when I ask you to speak." We entered the room, and the conversations immediately hushed. 7 pairs of eyes tracked us as we made our way to the table set up for appellants. Jason's white cane tapped rhythmically on the hardwood floor, amplified by the silence. Judge Harmon sat in the center wearing his black judicial robe, a relic from his days on the bench that he insisted on wearing for all HOA hearings. His silver hair was perfectly combed, gold-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. The community clubhouse had been arranged to resemble a courtroom, with Harmon's elevated desk positioned like a judge's bench. He didn't just act like a real judge. He made sure he looked the part too. Case number 47B, Reynolds property, violation of Section 12.3, unauthorized exterior modifications, announced the secretary. Harmon leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Mr. Reynolds, we've been quite patient with your continued violations. This hearing is merely a formality before we proceed with lien placement." Sarah stood immediately. "Good morning. I'm Sarah Jacobson, attorney for the Reynolds family. We're here regarding reasonable accommodations required under the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act." Harmon's expression hardened. "This is an HOA matter, not a federal case, Miss Jacobson. Our covenants are clear." "Federal law supersedes HOA covenants," Sarah interrupted smoothly, "as I'm sure a former judge understands perfectly well." A muscle twitched in Harmon's jaw. "Present your case quickly. We have other matters on the agenda." For 20 minutes, Sarah methodically outlined our position, citing specific statutes and precedents. Halfway through, I noticed several board members exchanging uncomfortable glances. When she finished, Harmon dismissed her presentation with a wave. "Emotional appeals don't change our covenants. Next case." "We haven't finished," Sarah said firmly. "My client's son would like to speak." "Unnecessary," Harmon snapped. "It is absolutely necessary that you hear from the person most affected by your decisions," Sarah countered. After a tense silence, Harmon sighed dramatically. 2 minutes. No more. Jason stood, his hand gripping his white cane. I guided him to the center of the room where everyone could see him. "My name is Jason Reynolds," he began, his voice slightly shaky but growing stronger with each word. 2 years ago, I lost my sight completely. Every day since then has been about learning to navigate a world I can no longer see." The room was completely silent as Jason continued. "Those tactile markers aren't decorations. They're how I find my way home. They're how I know where the curb is so I don't fall. They're how I maintain my independence." Jason turned his head, as if trying to face each person in the room. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the chance to move safely around my own home." I watched the board members' faces. Most looked uncomfortable. One woman was blinking back tears, but Judge Harmon's expression remained stone cold. As Jason finished speaking, I felt a swell of pride. My boy had shown more dignity and courage than anyone else in that room. As Jason stood there, vulnerable yet dignified, Judge Harmon suddenly pushed back his chair and stood up. The scrape of metal against wood broke the silence like a gunshot. He walked around the table, his footsteps deliberate and heavy on the hardwood floor. The room tensed as he approached Jason, stopping just 2 feet away from my son. "Young man," Harmon said, his voice dripping with condescension. "That was quite a performance." I started to rise from my seat, but Sarah placed a warning hand on my arm. Harmon took another step closer to Jason. "Let me be perfectly clear. Your disability doesn't entitle you to special treatment." He raised his finger, pointing it directly in Jason's face. Though my son couldn't see the finger hovering inches from his nose, he could feel the judge's presence invading his space, could sense the hostility radiating from him. "The rules of this community apply to everyone equally," Harmon continued, his voice rising. "We have standards here, standards that protect everyone's interests." Jason flinched slightly but held his ground. I could see his knuckles whitening as he gripped his cane. "But sir," Jason began, "the law says—" "Don't presume to lecture me about the law, boy," Harmon snapped, jabbing his finger closer to Jason's face. "I was interpreting laws before you were born." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one intervened. The other residents watched in shocked silence. "You think you can play the disability card and get whatever you want?" Harmon's voice rose further, echoing in the quiet room. "That's not how things work in Oakridge Estates." Jason's lower lip trembled slightly, but he stood tall. I had never been prouder or more heartbroken simultaneously. Harmon turned slightly, addressing the room while still pointing at my son. "If the Reynolds family needed special accommodations, they should have chosen a different community. Our aesthetic standards don't bend for anyone." That's when I couldn't stay silent any longer. I stood up. "Judge Harmon," I said, my voice steady despite the rage boiling inside me, "I request that your comments be entered into the official record of this hearing." Harmon turned to me, his expression contemptuous. "By all means," he said with a dismissive wave. "The record will show that your son's situation, while unfortunate, doesn't exempt your property from our community standards." "No," I clarified. "I want your exact words recorded. That my son is playing the disability card, that he should have chosen a different community. Every word exactly as you said it." I could see uncertainty flicker across Harmon's face for the first time. Sarah stepped forward smoothly. "And I'll need the board secretary to note that Judge Harmon approached and physically intimidated a disabled minor during an official proceeding." Harmon's face flushed crimson. "I did no such thing. I was merely emphasizing the community's position." "By pointing your finger in the face of a blind 17-year-old? I asked, my voice barely containing my fury. The room had transformed. What had been uncomfortable silence now felt like collective shock. Several residents were openly staring at Harmon with disgust. One of the board members, a middle-aged woman, was frantically whispering to her colleague. Harmon retreated a step from Jason, suddenly aware of how the scene appeared to everyone watching, but the damage was done. "Return to your seat, Mr. Reynolds," he ordered, attempting to regain control of the situation. "This hearing will proceed according to our established protocols." As I guided Jason back to our seats, I caught the eye of the board secretary. She had been typing furiously during the entire exchange, documenting every word of Harmon's tirade. Little did the judge know this moment would soon be his undoing. As we returned to our seats, I discreetly slipped my phone from my pocket and activated the recording app. If Harmon wanted his words on record, I'd make sure they were preserved exactly as spoken. "Let's move on," Harmon announced, clearly eager to put the confrontation behind him. "The board will now deliberate on the Reynolds case." Before he could continue, the door at the back of the room opened. A tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit entered, accompanied by two younger attorneys carrying legal briefcases. Sarah straightened in her seat, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Right on time," she whispered to me. The newcomer approached our table with purposeful strides. "William Thornton, senior partner at Thornton, Meyer and Associates," he announced, his voice carrying throughout the room. "I'll be joining Ms. Jacobson in representing the Reynolds family." A visible ripple of unease passed through the board members. One of them leaned over to whisper something to Harmon, whose face had suddenly paled. "This is highly irregular," Harmon protested. "Additional counsel cannot join mid-proceeding." "Actually, Judge Harmon," Thornton replied calmly, "HOA bylaw 8.4 specifically allows appellants to amend their representation at any point during a hearing." He smiled thinly. "As I'm sure you're aware." Without waiting for a response, Thornton signaled to his associates. They began distributing document folders to each board member. "What you're receiving," Thornton explained, "is a comprehensive legal brief detailing the multiple violations of the Fair Housing Act currently being perpetrated by this HOA under Judge Harmon's direction." The board members opened their folders, expressions of alarm spreading as they reviewed the contents. "Additionally," Thornton continued, "you'll find documentation of 17 case precedents where HOAs were found liable for denying reasonable accommodations to disabled residents. The average settlement in these cases exceeded $350,000, not including legal fees. The color drained from several board members' faces. One man loosened his tie, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Harmon's composure slipped further. "This is nothing but intimidation tactics. Our covenants clearly state—" "Your covenants," Thornton interrupted, "are subordinate to federal law. This isn't a matter of opinion, Judge Harmon. It's a matter of legal fact." He approached the board table, placing his hands on its surface and leaning forward slightly. "The Department of Housing and Urban Development takes disability discrimination cases very seriously. So does my firm. We've successfully represented 32 plaintiffs in similar situations." The room had transformed. What started as a routine HOA violation hearing had become something much more significant. "I don't believe Mr. Reynolds wants to pursue legal action," Thornton said, straightening up. "He simply wants his son to be able to navigate safely around his own home. A reasonable accommodation by any standard." One of the board members, a woman who had remained silent until now, cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should reconsider this case in light of this new information." "There's nothing to reconsider," Harmon insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "The board has consistently ruled against these types of modifications." "And that consistency," Thornton replied, "is precisely what establishes a pattern of discrimination. Legally speaking, you couldn't have provided us with better evidence if you'd tried." Harmon attempted to regain control of the room. "The board needs to discuss this privately. This hearing is adjourned until—" "One moment," Sarah interrupted, standing again. "Before we adjourn, I think it's important that the board hear the full context of Judge Harmon's earlier statements to young Jason Reynolds." She looked directly at me and nodded. I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen, and Judge Harmon's voice filled the room, crystal clear. "You think you can play the disability card and get whatever you want? That's not how things work in Oakridge Estates." As his own words echoed back at him, Harmon's face contorted with fury and fear. He knew, as everyone in the room now knew, that the tables had turned dramatically. The balance of power had shifted, and it would never shift back. "That recording is inadmissible," Harmon sputtered, his composed judicial demeanor crumbling. "It was made without consent." William Thornton smiled thinly. "Actually, Judge Harmon, this is a public hearing of record. There's no expectation of privacy, as I'm sure you're well aware." The female board member who had spoken earlier raised her hand tentatively. "I think we should take a short recess to—" "There will be no recess," Harmon cut her off. "As chairman, Perhaps," Thornton interjected smoothly, "the board would be interested in some additional information before deciding how to proceed." He nodded to one of his associates, who distributed a second set of folders. The room fell silent as the board members opened these new documents. I couldn't see what they contained, but the effect was immediate. One board member audibly gasped. Another removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes as if hoping the words would change when he looked again. "What you're reviewing," Thornton explained for everyone's benefit, "is evidence that Judge Walter Harmon has systematically denied accommodations to disabled residents throughout his tenure as Architectural Committee Chair." Sarah stepped forward, taking over the presentation. Case 1, Margaret Wilson, age 78, mobility impaired, denied permission for a safety railing on her front steps. Case 2, James Fitzgerald, veteran with PTSD, denied a privacy fence that his doctor prescribed as necessary for his condition. Case 3, Sophia Chen, multiple sclerosis, denied a wheelchair-accessible entrance modification. With each example, heads in the audience turned toward Harmon, whose face had gone from red to ashen. "In total," Sarah continued, "we've documented 14 cases where necessary disability accommodations were denied under Judge Harmon's leadership. This constitutes a clear pattern of discrimination under federal housing law." One of the board members, a balding man with glasses, spoke up. "Judge Harmon assured us these were all handled according to our bylaws." "They were," Thornton confirmed, "and that's precisely the problem. Your bylaws, as currently enforced, violate federal law." Sarah picked up a final document from her briefcase. "But perhaps most concerning is this." She held up a certificate. This is Judge Harmon's certification to serve as an HOA judicial officer." She paused, looking directly at Harmon. "Or rather, this is where it should be. Because despite serving as your judicial authority for 3 years, Judge Harmon has never completed the state-required certification process for HOA adjudicators." The room erupted in murmurs. One resident stood up, pointing at Harmon. "You told us you were fully certified when you ran for the board." Harmon rose from his seat, face contorted with rage. "This is a witch hunt. I will not stand for it." He pointed toward the door. "Security, remove the Reynolds family and their attorneys immediately." No one moved. The community security guard, a retired police officer, stood awkwardly near the door, clearly unwilling to intervene. "Additionally," Thornton continued as if there had been no outburst, "our investigation has uncovered something else the board might find concerning." He nodded to his second associate, who distributed the final set of documents. Financial records showing that Judge Harmon has received consulting fees from Oakridge Development Corporation for the past 4 years, the same company that built this community and maintains a financial interest in property values. A board member stood up, visibly shaken. "You've been paid by the developer while serving as our judicial officer? That's a direct conflict of interest." Another resident called out from the audience. "So he's been taking money to enforce their standards, even when it violates federal law?" Harmon slammed his hand on the table. "These allegations are completely false. I demand—" "They're documented facts," Thornton corrected calmly. "Banking records, payment vouchers, and your own tax returns, Judge Harmon." The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. Where Harmon once commanded respect and fear, now he faced open hostility from the very community he'd ruled with an iron fist. The female board member stood, her voice steady. "I move that we immediately approve the Reynolds accommodation request and suspend Judge Harmon from his position, pending a full investigation." "I second that motion," another board member quickly added. As the board secretary called for a vote, Harmon stood alone, his authority evaporating before his eyes. The unanimous vote was merely a formality. The revelation of his deception had already sealed his fate. My son leaned toward me, sensing the change in the room. "What's happening, Dad?" I squeezed his hand. "Justice, son. Justice is happening." The board vote was unanimous, 7-0 in favor of approving our accommodations and suspending Judge Harmon pending further investigation. The meeting adjourned in chaos, with residents crowding around us, offering support and sharing their own stories of Harmon's tyrannical rule. "I should have spoken up sooner," one elderly man told me, gripping my hand. "He denied my request for a medical emergency key box last year." As we left the clubhouse, Sarah explained our next steps. "This is just the beginning. Tomorrow we file a formal discrimination complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development." "Will that take long?" I asked, concerned about the markers Jason needed immediately. "The full investigation might, but we'll request emergency relief," William Thornton explained. "Given the evidence we have, they'll likely grant it." True to their word, our legal team filed the complaint first thing the next morning. By that afternoon, a HUD investigator was already reviewing our case. What happened next moved with a speed that surprised even our attorneys. The federal investigator assigned to our case, Angela Martinez, had specialized in disability discrimination for 15 years. She recognized the severity of our situation immediately. "This is one of the most clear-cut cases of discrimination I've seen," she told us 3 days later during a video call. "The recording alone is damning evidence." Within a week, HUD issued an emergency order requiring the HOA to immediately approve our tactile markers and cease all enforcement actions against us. But that was just the beginning. The HOA board, now in damage control mode, called an emergency community meeting. The clubhouse was packed. Nearly every resident attended. The interim board chairman, a retired school principal named Robert Chen, opened with a formal apology. "What happened to the Reynolds family represents a complete failure of leadership," he stated. "Our community was founded on principles of inclusion and respect, not discrimination and intimidation." Then came the announcement that stunned the room. The board has voted unanimously to remove Judge Walter Harmon from all positions within our community governance, effective immediately. A ripple of applause started, growing into thunderous approval. Residents who had suffered silently under Harmon's regime finally felt free to express their relief. But the consequences for Harmon extended far beyond our community. The State Bar Association launched its own investigation after receiving our evidence. Within 3 weeks, they issued their findings. Sarah called me with the news. The Bar Association has formally censured Harmon and revoked his certification to practice HOA law anywhere in the state. They can do that? I asked. His actions violated multiple ethical standards, plus he was practicing without proper certification. The bar takes that very seriously. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. Former judge disbarred from HOA practice after discrimination case. Harmon's reputation, built over decades, collapsed in less than a month. The final blow came when 3 other families filed their own discrimination complaints. The HOA's insurance company, faced with multiple potential lawsuits, forced a settlement. The terms were comprehensive: full approval of all reasonable accommodations for disabled residents, a complete overhaul of architectural guidelines, mandatory training for all board members on fair housing laws, and a significant financial settlement to each affected family. At the next board meeting, we watched as the members unanimously approved a new reasonable accommodation policy drafted with input from disability rights experts. The document explicitly stated that accessibility features would receive priority consideration and streamlined approval. When the chairman handed me the signed policy, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. This wasn't just about yellow tactile markers anymore. This was about changing an entire system that had failed people like my son. As we left the meeting, Robert Chen approached us. "Mr. Reynolds, the board has a request. We'd like your son to serve as a youth advisor to our new accessibility committee. His perspective would be invaluable." Jason's face lit up with pride. The same community that had once tried to erase his needs now wanted his voice to help shape its future. The installation crew arrived early Monday morning. They carefully placed our tactile markers according to the occupational therapist's specifications, creating a safe pathway for Jason throughout our property. The yellow strips stood out boldly against the concrete, visible guides for my invisible battles. As the workers packed up their equipment, our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, approached with a plate of cookies. "I'm so sorry I didn't speak up sooner," she said, genuine remorse in her eyes. "I was afraid of becoming Harmon's next target." That afternoon, my phone rang continuously with calls from other residents. Some offered belated support, others shared their own stories of intimidation. The community was healing, finding its voice after years of silence. The changes spread beyond our home. Within a month, 5 other families installed accessibility features: a wheelchair ramp, a sensory garden for an autistic child, a service dog relief area. Each approval came swiftly under the new guidelines. Jason's confidence grew with each passing day. With his markers securely in place, he began venturing out alone, navigating our neighborhood with his white cane and newfound independence. "Dad, I made it all the way to the corner store by myself today," he announced one afternoon, his face glowing with achievement. This victory, this simple act of independence, meant more than any legal win. Word of our case spread to neighboring communities. The president of Riverside Estates, a development 3 miles away, called requesting a meeting. "We've got similar issues," she admitted. "Could you consult on our disability policies before we end up in the same situation?" Judge Harmon, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his actions. His legal consulting business collapsed as word spread of his disbarment from HOA practice. He quietly put his house on the market and moved away without saying goodbye to anyone. The final letter from HUD arrived 6 weeks after our hearing. It officially closed the investigation, citing comprehensive remediation by the HOA. Attached was a personal note from Investigator Martinez. "Your courage has created lasting change. This case will serve as a training example for years to come." Perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the community's annual summer picnic. Jason and I were setting up our chairs when Robert Chen clinked his glass for attention. Today we're not just celebrating summer, he announced to the gathered families. We're celebrating a more accessible, inclusive community, thanks to the courage of Jason Reynolds and his father. The spontaneous applause that followed wasn't just for us. It was for every resident who had found their voice, for every accommodation that made our community stronger rather than weaker. As we sat enjoying the sunshine, Jason leaned toward me. "Dad," he said quietly, "remember when I asked why that judge hated me because I was blind?" "I remember," I said, my throat tightening. "I think I understand now. He wasn't seeing me at all. He was just seeing rules. But now everyone sees me, the real me." I watched my son, his face turned toward the sun he couldn't see but could still feel. In that moment, I knew that our fight had been worth every difficult second. Standing up to bullies isn't easy, especially when they hide behind authority and rules. That day in the hearing room, when that judge pointed his finger in my blind son's face, he thought his power was absolute. He was wrong. Sometimes justice requires courage, the courage to speak when others are silent, to fight when the odds seem insurmountable, to stand firm when powerful people try to push you down. One person with the determination to do what's right can transform an entire community. Our battle wasn't just about yellow tactile markers on a driveway. It was about dignity, about the right of every person to live independently regardless of their abilities. That judge pointed his finger at my son's face, but justice pointed right back at him.